Now that you know a great deal more about nonpolar covalent substances, substances that share pairs of electrons evenly within molecules, let's turn our attention to polar covalent substances with bonds that share electrons unevenly, so there's positive and negative sticky spots on the outsides of the molecules. Now again, remember, covalent bonds occur when atoms share pairs of electrons, and polar covalent bonds happen when those electrons are shared unevenly. This is not the same as an ionic bond, where we have an atom that has gained or lost electrons, like this zinc atom that lost 2 electrons, and this chlorine atom that gained an extra electron, so they have opposite charges. And because the zinc attracts chlorine and the chlorine attracts zinc, they're going to stick together to make a crystal substance. This is an ionic bond because first the atoms gained or lost electrons. Even though there are positive and negatives involved, with polar covalent bonds, we are not talking about positive and negative charged ions. Instead, we're talking about parts of molecules that have these small positive and negative charges along the outside of the molecule. This bond is nowhere as strong as the bonds between ions, but it does cause matter to behave in certain ways because these positive and negative parts exist. Those positives are going to attract negative parts of other molecules, and the negatives are going to attract positive parts of other molecules, and they're going to behave the same way that ions behave a little bit, but they're not nearly as strongly attracted. So just to give you an idea of how these are kind of like ions, here is a ammonia molecule with its positive and negatively charged part. And here's another ammonia molecule, and notice the negative part is attracted to the positive part of a different one. And what's going to end up happening is when a bunch of ammonia comes together, there's going to be this weak attraction trying to pull these ammonia molecules together to the point where ammonia is a liquid at room temperature, and it's very easy to evaporate to become a gas. It's not very strongly pulled together, but it is being pulled together by these dipoles. Another example of something that's affected by these polar covalent bonds that has a positive dipole and a negative dipole is water. Water has positive dipoles where the hydrogens are because its electrons are being shared inwards, so that leaves a positive charge on the other side, and a negative dipole where the oxygen just has unshared electrons that are going to form a negative part to the molecule. Water molecules attract other water molecules because the positive parts attract negative parts and the negative parts attract positive parts. Water's kind of interesting though because of the arrangement of the positive and negative dipoles. It tends to make 6-sided hexagonal shapes, and as it freezes, it comes together with these 6-sided shapes to make 6-sided crystals, which you've seen if you've seen a snowflake up close. You see those 6-sided crystals that water forms as it has time to slowly freeze, and the atoms and molecules can arrange themselves in these 6-sided shapes. And let's look at yet another example of a polar covalent substance. Let's look at a sugar molecule. Sugar molecules are really big, and they share a lot of electrons in pairs within the molecule. But there are also a lot of places around the outside where the electrons are not being shared evenly, and there's positive and negative sticky spots so that the sugar molecules can bond together. Here's a map of where all of those positive and negative dipoles are around the outside of a sugar molecule. And what ends up happening is sugar molecules will attract each other at those positive and negative spots. The positives attract the negatives and the negatives attract the positives. So sugar basically sticks together molecule to molecule. Now again, you can easily break these dipole-dipole bonds because they're not really all that strong. You can easily break them by heating sugar up and causing it to melt. The problem with sugar is that the covalent bonds inside also aren't really all that strong. So as you heat it up, it actually decomposes and the molecule breaks apart and makes different substances as well. That's what gives off that beautiful toasted marshmallow smell as you heat up sugar. All right, let's quickly talk about those bonds in just a little bit more depth. There's a very technical name for those weaker bonds that form between polar covalent substances. They're called intermolecular bonds because they are weaker bonds that hold molecules to other molecules. That's what inter means. It means between, and we're talking about between molecules, not between the atoms within the molecule. Those are different bonds, those covalent bonds that are really, really strong. One type of intermolecular bond is a dipole-dipole bond, where those positively charged parts attract those negatively charged parts. And that's what we've been talking about a lot. This is a substance known as iodine monochloride. Iodine monochloride has 8 electrons around each of the 2 atoms that make it up, with a covalent bond in the middle. And you'll notice that the electrons are more together around the chlorine and more spread out around the iodine. That causes the chlorine to have a more negative charge and the iodine to have a more positive charge. And what that causes is that these molecules will bond together with these weak intermolecular dipole-dipole bonds. There's going to be positive parts attracting negative parts. Now, it's not a full-on ionic bond because we don't have atoms gaining or losing electrons. These are just parts around the outside of the molecules that are sticky, positively and negatively charged. Now, there is a slight difference between this and what happens with water with hydrogen bonds, where there's actually a hydrogen atom that has both of its electrons shared inward, and there's a full-on positively charged part of the hydrogen atom sticking out on the outside. Hydrogen bonds are a special type of dipole-dipole bond that's a little bit stronger because there's an all-out positive charge sticking out on the side. This same kind of stronger hydrogen bond forms between molecules of ammonia, which is the same sort of thing. All right, and then finally, the properties of polar substances. Because they have these dipole-dipole bonds that have positive and negative charges of varying strength, they can have a fairly strong attraction. Sometimes they have a very weak attraction. They're kind of all over the board with the strength of attraction. That gives them sometimes very low melting and boiling points to medium melting and boiling points. Some of them even can, maybe in rare exceptions, have higher melting and boiling points, but nowhere near as high as ionic compounds are capable of. And then finally, they do dissolve in other polar substances like water. Here's why. Water molecules, remember, are polar and they attract one another, but they can also attract those positive and negative sticky spots on the outside of the molecules. And what that causes to happen is because the water surrounds and attracts and pulls these molecules apart, they will spread out and dissolve in water. So now again, you know what a polar bond is, where electron pairs are shared unevenly, giving these compounds a very unique set of properties.